Welcome, free spirits, to question and answer session number 9 here on the Nietzsche podcast. Kind of wild to think about that we're on the 9th one of these, but here we are. So as usual, I will be answering questions from patrons. So if you would like to have your question answered in an episode just like this one, head on over to patreon.com/untimelyreflections. And as always, the link is in the description. So without further ado, let's get into it. Connor ORT asks, would be curious to hear your thoughts on Byung-Chul Han if you're familiar with his work and what you think Nietzsche would have to say about him. Also would be interested if you have any music album recommendations, either recent releases or all-time faves. Thanks, Connor. So I have only a passing familiarity with Byung-Chul Han. I went and did some brushing up on his work in preparation for recording this. And the main thing that I remembered and that I went and looked up some quotes about is his work on transparency. And Byung-Chul Han seems to think that what's happening in the economic forces of today's society, which are not easily described by either communism or capitalism, any of these sort of outdated models for how we think about economics, which is something I completely agree with, that we need to sort of leave a lot of these models behind because, and this is just me talking here, it's not Han, I feel oftentimes that the way we talk about economics is almost like we're using the language of feudalism to talk about capitalism. Well, now we're using the language of capitalism to talk about whatever this is. You can call it late-stage capitalism or something of that nature, but it's very clear to me the public and the private sectors are merging in some sense. It's not entirely clear. Is a tech platform a private enterprise or an arm of the public sector? Well, in a lot of ways, it's both. And another aspect of those tech platforms and social media is that Han sees the ways in which they have become a medium for people to overshare to the point of almost like voyeurism or pornography is the way that he describes it. And so what do I mean by that? Well, it's a new model for the economy in which everyone owns the means of production, which are themselves. We all are no longer subjects of the rule of the capitalist class, or we don't perceive ourselves that way. We all perceive ourselves as being a resource that we can exploit. And so this might be, I'm doing it right now, right? I'm using my resources, my talents, my ability to speak, my time and effort to record, my knowledge of Friedrich Nietzsche and my understanding. That is an immaterial mode of production that I own, and that I am now able to turn that mode of production myself. I'm able to use it to crank out podcasts, right? And that's my way of advancing myself in this new economy that's been created. But that ranges all over the place, right? I mean, there's some podcasters that they're doing their best to they're becoming a personality that creates these parasocial relationships with their audience. It can be rather, literally pornographic, right? I mean, so I recently got onto X, Twitter, and one of the first things I see is an ad for OnlyFans, where there's one of their models, we'll say to be polite, and she's riding her bike in the park talking about how OnlyFans has allowed her the economic freedom to be her authentic self, right? And so this is Han's explanation for why the neoliberal late-stage capitalist system is so stable that it hasn't sublated itself into the Marxist socialist revolution, because people don't see themselves as part of this antagonistic class struggle. Everyone sees that they own an immaterial means of production, which is themselves. They can share about their personality. They can share their talents. They could literally share their physical body. They can bear everything in whatever sense in order to be economically productive, right? And perhaps the problem with this that one might see, and something that Han points out, which is very astute. For one, we have all of these mental illnesses now in modern society that could be sourced to this sort of society of openness or transparency. But perhaps a deeper issue, which is something that I think he's really insightful to point out. In a totalitarian society, the society is 100% transparent and open. And we might say, what are you saying? Transparency, openness, vulnerability, these are good things. These are good liberal values. We want a transparent society. Things like secrets and privacy and shame, those are sort of, the value of shame or the value of keeping secrets. These might be seen as sort of old world values. But Hahn, I think, understands there is a worth to those kinds of social mores that we would lose, and that in a perfectly totalitarian society, it's perfectly open. There's no secrets from anyone. I mean, that's the world of 1984, to draw upon the stereotypical example at this point. No one has anything that they can withhold from the party. Everything is a matter of open record. And so, in a sense, we're all voluntarily marching into this totalitarian, totalizing openness, this totalizing transparency in society. And, again, it's voluntary. An example I've often used when it comes to the Matrix, I've often said that when the Matrix comes, we will voluntarily go into it. We will plug ourselves into the Matrix. We will get into the Rawlsian experience machine because a sufficient number of people are going to say, I prefer this to reality. And I think that's sad, but I think it's also true. Similarly, people are voluntarily walking into this state of total openness. And, they're not having to be forced. It's not like Big Brother. And so what would Nietzsche think about this? I mean, so as far as my opinion, I think he's largely correct. But again, I have to point out, I'm not very familiar with his work. This is just a cursory reading and based on what I already kind of know about him from just osmosis, from talking with other people I know and friends who have read his work and things like that. But I will say, I think with the caveat that I don't ever want to speak about what Nietzsche would think about new social developments brought on by new technology, because it's just so hard to say. What would Nietzsche have made of the internet? What would he have made of social media? Would Nietzsche... would much of his political commentary apply given that our situation now in our economic and political models have kind of gone beyond the old language that we use to talk about it in ways that are not, I don't think, even widely perceived yet? I mean, it's very hard to say what Nietzsche would have said about any of this. But that being said, I think Nietzsche would have seen there's an inherently democratic driving force behind social media. And what I mean by that is what's popular, or what does well on social media is what trends, right? What's popular, what's based on the momentary, what's based on impulses, insofar as what people click on often has to do with an emotional response that they're having, which may not be even conscious to them, although a lot of times it is. Something will just consciously make them mad. I mean, we use the language of it. We understand when you say clickbait, you're laying out bait for somebody, because we know that we kind of have these emotional hooks that can grab us and drag us in. And that's the landscape in which all of this unfolds. And so I think he would have seen like an inherent plebeianism to the internet and social media that, I mean, on some level it's somewhat meaningless or uninteresting to me to just say that, well, Nietzsche would have had a problem with that, because on some level, who cares? Yeah, that's his opinion. But I think Nietzsche, the relevant thing is that he would see this leading to the same kinds of dysfunctions that perhaps Hahn sees, of this rise of a plethora of mental illnesses among the population, and people becoming sort of hyper-focused on the moment and turning away from everything that's untimely or meaningful in the grand sense. And, so I think you could interpret Byung-Chul Han in a way that would be commensurate with Nietzsche's philosophy. But I'm just always a bit reticent to make claims like that, especially when I don't know the work of the author in question as well as I'd like to. And so if there's anything by Byung-Chul Han that you think I should read, please leave it in the comments when I post this and let me know, and maybe we can do an episode on him someday. As far as musical recommendations, somebody recently asked me about what my favorite rock band was, my favorite all-time rock band. This was on a YouTube comment. And the answer that I always come to with rock music is The Devil's Blood. And that might sound like some, brutal, rah-rah, screamy music. It's not at all. I would compare them to Rocky Erickson. That's one of their influences. And that band was really important to me, very formative musically. They broke up, I believe, in 2013, 2014, maybe a little sooner than that. The main songwriter killed himself and everything. It's satanic in its subject matter. So, if you have a problem with that, it might be a bit hard to listen to. But just musically, amazing stuff. As far as doom metal, like the genre that I play in, I would highly recommend listening to Paul Bearer's Sorrow and Extinction. That's a wonderful record. Or if you want something that's a little more progressive by them, their album Heartless is a good one. Those are, fair enough intros to doom metal. Other than that, I've been listening to a lot of Skin Shape recently, which is some great sort of lo-fi indie bluesy music. I've just been listening to the best of, so. And there's a jazz kind of lo-fi project called Vanilla, which is also really good if you like, if you like some beats to study to kind of vibe, right? So those are my recent recommendations, just off the top of my head, what I've been thinking of. So let's go on to the next question. Sean Hart, are you familiar with the teaching of Gurdjieff, also called the work or the fourth way? This system aims at developing man, or perhaps a man, to a higher state, perhaps ultimately to what Gurdjieff calls man number 7. Of course, Nietzsche's Overman comes to mind, but the Gurdjieff work is related historically to theosophy. People debate this, and Gurdjieff himself often equated the work with esoteric Christianity. What's a Nietzschean to think? Thank you, Sean. I'm familiar with Gurdjieff. I remember I first looked into him when I heard Alan Watts talk about Gurdjieff. And is he related to theosophy? People may debate this. So the reason why this is even debatable is because a lot of these guru or sage-like figures like Gurdjieff also leave behind like philosophical writings, and they don't necessarily... How would I put this? It feels very different from the standard religious fare when you don't have to assent to a number of doctrines or dogmas. You don't have to, submit to Allah or declare Jesus Christ as your personal savior and then follow all these rules. Gurdjieff is sort of more along the lines of the Zen masters where, they use expedient means. So according to the situation, according to the needs of the student, you might teach them in a different way. You're not really tied down to any doctrines or dogmas that you have to drum into their heads or anything like that. As for the fourth way, if I recall, so it's the fakir, the monk, and the yogi are like the first three ways, and I forget, those like relate to like body, mind, and spirit, or no, body, mind, and emotion. And don't ask me to tell you which corresponds to which one, but that there were these three different kinds of spiritual paths that focused on one of these tripartite aspects of the self. And I think Gurdjieff's been compared to Plato and Socrates in this respect because it's very similar to the tripartite structure of the mind that we find there, and that he sort of sees there were different spiritual paths going by the way of, so I think the monk is like, I think that has to do with the physical body because the monk lives an ascetic life, right? They deny themselves all these physical or sensuous pleasures. Whereas the yogi, I can't remember if it's the mind or the emotions, but you're turning inward and you're meditating and you're trying to attain enlightenment or some sort of spiritual awakening by that path, whereas the monk is sort of just doing it by, living simply, living in a simple brotherly community and not, getting entangled with the world, so to speak. And the fourth way is Gurdjieff's way, which is more amenable to the life of the modern person, that integrates all the different sort of aspects of the human mind and deals with this on the grounds of modernity as we live it now. Although I am going to be perfectly honest, I do not know what man number 7 is, or what man number 1 through 6 is, for that matter. I didn't look that deeply into Gurdjieff, but as far as what a Nietzschean is to think, I don't know if I can, in good conscience, correlate these ideas with Nietzsche's Overman, mainly because Gurdjieff believes that we're all walking around basically asleep in a sort of dream-like reality. And that is the core claim of Buddhism as well, by the way, that that's what Buddha means. It means awakened. So the Buddha is to us as we are to people who are asleep. That's how much more aware and in touch with the real reality that Buddha is within the Buddhist ideology than the average person. I don't see how you make claims like that without claiming some sort of true world that's behind the physical phenomenal reality in which we are all living. And even though you could couch those teachings in terms that are just purely, we might say, existentialist, of just sort of coming into your own, becoming who you are, maybe it doesn't have to have any of those associations with an other world or some sort of spiritual reality behind things. But I guess I'm suspicious of schema like this, that you are not, going around sort of telling people that they're sick and you're not a fully integrated person, and that this is sort of the natural default state of humanity, is like this sickly being that's not integrated between their heart and their mind and their willpower or spirit or whatever it might be, and that you need this teaching in order to wake up to reality as it is. Whereas what Nietzsche is pointing to is what he calls the great health of living in this reality in a profound way, accepting, embracing this reality in a profound way. And that the Overman, one way you could look at it is the human being that is completely free of resentment and the bad conscience, who has completely overcome those things. But resentment and the bad conscience are not inherent to human beings just as human beings. Those are created by the dark workshop, or the dismal workshop of all of these ascetic ideals that have been imposed on mankind. That it's not something inherent to us. It's a way in which we have degenerated and become this sickly animal, so to speak. And that, Nietzsche in some ways is trying to get us to just cast off the chains that he's saying these have been artificially imposed on us and there's no reason why we ought to have them. Whereas I feel like somebody like Gurdjieff, and I could be wrong about this, I'm open to correction, seems to be one of these guru types who thinks, mankind is sort of born in chains just inherently as a, just a consequence of living in this material realm. And, you need to wake up to this true spiritual reality. So, I don't know. I have to say, I am a little biased. I'm suspicious of all such characters like this. I mean, Osho was somebody, Bhagavan Sri Rajneesh really often had a lot of praise for Gurdjieff. And, there's differing views on kind of his personality and what motivated him, but it does seem like he created a personality cult around himself and sort of aggrandized himself as this kind of figure. And I'm personally not attracted to that. That seems like I would just be putting myself into another kind of conformity, and I'm not really into it. It's not my scene. That being said, Alan Watts was another kind of guru type figure, but I like him because he was like kind of an anti-guru, and one of the things he said about Gurdjieff was that he was contrasting him with the Taoist path of spirituality. And he said, one of the great gambits of Gurdjieff was that he made it all seem as difficult as possible because it challenged the vanity of his students. And I know people like this. I have a really close friend who, anytime he would he would sort of have these fads, monthly fads, or maybe every other month, right? He would get into something else. So he would get into golf, and then he would be like, I'm going to get all the best clubs, and then I'm going to go on all of these forums and read and find out what the best, what the consensus opinion is, like what is the best driver to have. And then, the next week it would be something else. I'm really into, I've become a vegetarian now, and I'm learning all these things about vegetarian cooking, and all the people in the Austin subreddit say this is the best vegetarian restaurant to go to. And I could see that somebody like him, if he were to get involved with spirituality and go study under Gurdjieff, it would appeal to his vanity to have somebody like Gurdjieff tell him, yes, this is incredibly hard, and you're in the know. You're one of the people with the special esoteric knowledge now that you've learned all of the tips and tricks that we've told, and this is the best thing around, and it's so hard. The average person can't do this. That was always sort of what I get the impression appealed to this person that I know about these fads and becoming an expert within 1 to 3 months about a given subject that he was into. And so I thought that was rather insightful of Watts, and that's kind of what I like about Alan Watts, was he was saying, meanwhile, the Taoist just says, oh, this isn't difficult at all. It's incredibly easy. You just let go. Just let go of your karma without challenging it. And, I don't want to really go further into that. You can go look up the Alan Watts lecture, The Taoist Way, if you want to know about this. It's actually a very informative lecture about that whole sort of spiritual tradition. Also, another personal anecdote. I had I'm trying to think of how to describe the nature of this relationship. So my dad has a very close friend from college, and his friend's family, their sort of immediate family, and my immediate family we were always close, right? And we'd always visit them. They lived in New Mexico, and my dad's family lives in Colorado. And so on the way back from Colorado, every year we would stop by their house. And one year we were at their house in New Mexico, and the family friend's brother is there. And he was this eccentric character who rode his motorcycle all over America, and he had sort of I'm not exactly sure, I was like a teenager when I was learning about this guy, so I'm not exactly sure the nature of this, but he had like a school for young men where he was trying to shape young minds. And, I remember he was really drunk, and it was a sort of a holiday Christmas party, and he kind of cornered me, and I thought he was an interesting guy to talk to, but he was getting really intense, and I didn't know it at the time, but he was basically preaching Gurdjieff's philosophy to me. He was like, if you you have a heart, you have a mind, you have willpower, and if any one of those is lacking, then you're 2/3 dead, man. You're 2/3 dead. And I just remember getting to the point where I was really uncomfortable. I didn't know how to respond to this guy. And I remember like later when I read about Gurdjieff, I was like, oh, that's what he was on about. It's interesting when you hear people express ideas and then later you learn where they came from. So that's my best attempt at answering that question. Robert Sullivan, longtime patron, asks, I understand the ascetic ideal as practiced by priests and religionists is life and reality denying by withdrawing from the real world. Yet I have a hard time seeing Nietzsche's view of science as being another type of ascetic ideal. Science concerns itself with the real material world. If science is another form of asceticism, how can it compare to religious asceticism? Well, there are other aspects of asceticism than that, and the main thing would be self-denial as power. We talked about this in the Beyond Good and Evil read-through analysis that I did. That is, the aspect you mentioned is very important, and it is, in a sense, the way that asceticism justifies itself. But this asceticism of self-denial as a form of power can exist even without, strictly speaking, an other world. So you could say that a lot of self-help has this structure. If you deny yourself, all of these pleasures that you enjoy, you go on a diet and you go and you work out at the gym and you do X, Y, and Z, you will eventually reach a form of happiness through that act of self-denial. Now, obviously, to some extent, that's just true. You need to be able to make such sacrifices in order to attain the goals that you want. So it's not as if the ascetic ideal exists. Some people like Devin Gore, who I interviewed, says that's part of the whole right-wing workout culture that exists now, and the hustle and grind culture. And I think he's right to some extent, because quite a few people will get drawn in by that, and they're never going to reach that goal that they think that they're being promised that they're going to reach. Or another thing we might look at is the NoFap movement, where I understand there's a real benefit to be gained from abstaining from these probably very harmful forms of, literal pornography and, that many people get sucked into. On the other hand, some of the claims made by these people that, once you get into a couple months in, you'll have just heightened sensory awareness, and it almost borderlines on the supernatural with some of the things that they claim that you'll gain. You'll just have this indescribable animal magnetism about you, and you'll be reaching higher jhanas of spiritual enlightenment just from not touching yourself. That does border on the ascetic ideal. So the question then is, does science contain that sort of asceticism in it? And Nietzsche thinks that it does. And I think I should say the nature of Nietzsche's claim here really has to do with what we might call the scientific impulse or tendency to totalize the will to truth. And as for what that means, I went ahead and I pulled up my copy of Deleuze's Nietzsche and Philosophy, because he puts this really well. This is in the section on critique, section number 15, entitled New Image of Thought, where he writes, quote, "We are told that the thinker as thinker wants and loves truth, that thought as thought possesses or formally contains truth, that thinking is the natural exercise of a faculty, that it is therefore sufficient to think truly or really in order to think with truth. We are also told that we are diverted from the truth, but by forces which are foreign to it, body, passions, sensuous interests. We fall into error, we take falsehood to be truth, because we are not merely thinking beings." Okay, so, end quote. That, I think, is the ascetic ideal as Nietzsche sees it in science. That there's this notion that science can somehow approximate or even reach this state of, quote, really thinking about the world, of thinking about the actual true reality. That there's something incredibly valuable in Nietzsche coming out of the Neo-Kantian tradition and being a post-Schopenhauerian, so to speak, because Nietzsche is always distrustful of this idea that the phenomenal world, or the world of the senses, somehow corresponds to some sort of objective, mind-independent reality. Even in rejecting the true world, he never comes to the belief that what the phenomenal world represents is that. And that, on the contrary, as living beings, that is simply not, it's not in our hardware to perceive such an objective, mind-independent reality. Such a thing is in some ways a contradiction in terms, because how could our mind perceive a reality which exists independently of our minds, in some sense is always beyond our minds. We can't ever have confirmation in our own mind, so to speak, that the reality that we're seeing is somehow objective, that we're perceiving it the way that an immaculate perceiver would perceive it. All of this is just to say the resulting attitude from this sort of view of truth is to see all of the aspects of the human being, the living aspects, which are not oriented towards this type of objective truth seeking as somehow a hindrance towards it, and something that we have to, with a stoical sort of resolve, overcome or suppress in that ascetic manner. And, one way to look at this might be that if we consider the sophists, the rhetoricians of ancient Greece, or Thucydides, the Greek historian whom Nietzsche thinks is a great representative of the culture of the sophists, they do not make it their business to represent this mind-independent reality. They don't conceive of the truth in that way. They don't conceive of human thought as oriented towards that project. Human thought and human speech is the articulation of one's perspective, which includes within it all of those living aspects, your emotions, your perspective, who and what you are, the sense and value that you have of things. And you articulate that when you're up on the stage as an orator, giving an argument for your position. If you're a sophist, you're not trying to ascetically overcome these biases that you may have as a living being in service of this disembodied, detached, dispassionate truthfulness. You're speaking earnestly and sincerely from your perspective and trying to be as persuasive and forceful as you can, and making that perspective apprehend upon the minds of others. And the most nuanced and subtle of the sophists, of whom I would count Nietzsche, see an inherent value in the clash between perspectives, which, that there's something to be said for that in its own right. But just on the most basic level, we could compare it to the way a lot of mature journalists see journalism, where they don't consider it their job to be unbiased. They understand that since that is actually impossible, if they have the pretension of being unbiased, that all that's going to happen is that their biases will remain unconscious to them. And then they'll end up perverting or distorting their understanding of the facts without even being aware of it. That the proper thing to do is to be aware of your biases and to be open about them. And then that way, you'll, in some paradoxical way, actually be less susceptible to error. And so hopefully that gets across the point that science has this idea, this image of thought, as Deleuze calls it, that thought contains a constituent part of it is truthfulness or seeking the truth, and that what thought articulates are claims with truth values about the world, and that the Nietzschean image of thought is one in which sense and value are the constituent parts of thought. The sense that you have of things based on who and what you are, and the values that things hold for you based on your perspective and what advantages you, and so on and so forth. And so science, in attempting to overcome that, or this totalizing will to truth in attempting to overcome that, which Nietzsche thinks characterizes the scholars, these sort of pretensions of the academic types, who think that they can set aside all of those messy living aspects of themselves, all of those emotions and past experiences and biases, and just objectively commit themselves to determining the facts. Nietzsche thinks that that is fundamentally a mistake, but apropos to your question, it is a new form of the ascetic ideal. Even we, godless anti-metaphysicians, as Nietzsche says, still carry that fire that Plato lit, that God is truth and truth is divine. So, I hope that answers your question. Next one from Marcus R. Have you encountered Peter Sloterdijk and his work during your research for the podcast and or in general? If so, do you plan on doing an episode on him? I hadn't planned on talking about Peter Sloterdijk, and he's another figure that I have only a cursory awareness of, although a bit more than Byung-Chul Han. He gave that speech on the centennial of Nietzsche's death in 2000 about narcissism and language, which is really fascinating, and I would suggest the listeners to check that out. Basically what he says is that something that Nietzsche discovers is that narcissism is baked into our use of language, we might say. That, this is sort of the position that I was just articulating with the sophists, the rhetoricians, that Nietzsche, by drawing on their viewpoint, comes to this understanding that our use of language is, in some sense, always a post hoc rationalization for the values that have already been determined on, in Nietzsche's view, a physiological basis. That, as he gets into the master and slave morality, our position in the social structure and in the power relationships of society, that is going to determine what sorts of values that we hold. And then from those initial axioms, the values, these physiological demands for the preservation of a certain way of life, we then articulate arguments which are inherently self-serving. Or from the viewpoint of narcissism, as Sloterdijk puts it, in order to glorify what we are, glorify what we have done in our lives and our life path and all of our different identity categories to which we belong, and that's inherently what the use of language is about in oratory. But, of course, following the ascension of Christian values in the West, what happens is that a narcissistic capitulation to how great you are and just using your words just for your own self-justification and self-aggrandizement becomes seen as sort of unseemly or immoral, and that we then have to indirectly carry out this process. And so the example he uses is the eulogy. We can use our speech in praise of someone else who has just died and talk about all of their good or positive qualities, but we would look upon someone giving a speech about themselves in that manner in a rather negative light. Now, I'm not sure if he's entirely correct about that. There are some public figures who will, these days, just nakedly go about such a narcissistic display. But one of the things he's pretty insightful about is that if you read Ecce Homo, Nietzsche is engaging in what Nietzsche would see as the sort of old world, old style self-aggrandizement of narcissistic use of language, insofar as Nietzsche is saying, this is why I am so clever, this is why I am so wise, this is why I write such good books. And that in doing this, it's another performative way in which Nietzsche is striking back against those Christian values of imposing humility upon yourself and making an enemy of your own pride and your own self-love. And Nietzsche gets a lot of this from La Rochefoucauld, that underneath the veneer that we present, the moral veneer, what is often beneath it is simply a recapitulation to your own self-love. And in seeing that dynamic, Nietzsche comes to see, okay, the reason for this veneer is the Christian morality, but beneath it is what the real raw, unvarnished truth is, that we all have this force of pride or vanity or self-love, that we simply use the whole realm of ideas, the whole surface and sign world of language is simply a means of post hoc justification for what we already believe as regards our self-worth. So, that's something that Peter Sloterdijk wrote about, and I don't really know much about him outside of that, but It's a very good speech, and it's been reproduced in the form of an essay, I believe. You should be able to find it online. I think it's on Project Gutenberg, but I could be wrong about that, but you can find it. It's out there. So that's what I would recommend. Maybe we'll talk about Sloterdijk. We're kind of getting into the period of the podcast where more and more I'm going to be talking about interpreters of Nietzsche, people who came after Nietzsche rather than people who influenced him. And I was sort of trying to cover the last swathe of major influences on Nietzsche's thought in this season. So maybe someday. It's very possible. Okay, next question. All right, we have a question from Good Medicine. Do you think Hegel's teleology is borrowed from the Judeo-Christian teleology that God is working through history for some grand purpose? Do you think that Hegel was an architect of modern authoritarianism? How do you define existentialism? Do you consider Nietzsche an existentialist, and if so, why? And finally, a lighter question. Billy Squire's song, The Stroke, has been a topic of debate among me and some of my female friends. What is he singing about? I know he was talking about the music industry. Your thoughts on the music industry and its dirty side? And play a bit of the song for us, please. Well, unfortunately, Good Medicine, I can't do that because that will that will attract the attention of the Spotify and YouTube ghouls who will come for either to do a copyright claim or something of that nature, and it's more of a headache than it's worth to play the songs of that you don't own in a podcast. But so I guess since I'm already talking about the song, I mean, anyone out there listening though, you've probably heard this song. It's a standard sort of 80s headbanging. I don't know if I'd call it a hair metal track, but it's definitely in that vein. And what is he singing about? I mean, I always thought it was just kind of a sex thing, but I can see what you're talking about. Maybe it's about the music industry, because almost every major band that, maybe not these days, but when I was growing up with my parents' record collection, they had all the classic rock records, and I kind of worked my way through them. Everyone has a song about the music industry, either overtly or covertly. And a lot of times they release those as singles. A lot of times some executive will say, give us a single, and they say, okay, here's your single. It's a song about how you're a pimp and, you're prostituting me out to the world. And so there's often this sort of playful attempt to, to make the song about sex when it's really not about sex. It's about the dominating or exploitative aspects of the music industry, which can be compared to sort of pimps and prostitutes and things of that nature. There's a Hunter S. Thompson quote that says it better than I ever could. The music industry is a cruel and shallow money trench. A place where good men die like dogs and pimps and thieves roam free. There's also a negative side. That's how it goes, and a lot of bands have talked about it, and a lot of them use sex metaphors. And why would they do that? I mean, because sex sells. So the audience wants to hear songs about sex, whatever people might claim. They want that lowest common denominator, hedonistic romance and sex. That's what is often the topic of your top 40 hits. So, but given that there is that tyrannical impulse involved in sexuality, you can often use that as a way to talk about sort of the seedier sides of the music industry. That being said, I don't know what was in his mind, and it's hard for me to necessarily interpret those lyrics one way or the other definitively. There are some aspects that definitely seem like when I went and read the lyrics, I in preparation for recording this, because I'd never read the lyrics. I just assumed it was like, oh, this song's just, standard fare sex topic. There were a couple lines where I was like, oh, I think music industry, possible here. But, I just don't know. But let's get to your questions. So Hegel's teleology is borrowed from the Judeo-Christian teleology that God is working through history for some grand purpose. I think that's certainly influential on Hegel. I think that idea of the world soul unveiling itself over the course of history definitely evolves out of that idea of God's grand plan for mankind. Mankind having sort of a special destiny, some sort of end which we are serving. I don't think you can really understand Hegel without seeing that connection. Do I think Hegel was an architect of modern authoritarianism? I don't think that's fair, actually. I mean, what people will bring up is Hegel's conception of the state at the end of history. But I think that if you're going to saddle Hegel with that blame, then you also have to saddle Plato with that blame. And, you could say that any political theory is likely, or just one of the perennial aspects of political theory, is giving you an image of what their ideal is for, okay, if I got everything I wanted and I was king of the world, what would the world look like? A lot of political theorists do this exercise, and here's my ideal republic, Thomas More's Utopia. And, is that responsible for authoritarianism? Or are authoritarians just enacting or following that same tendency or impulse that's being expressed by philosophers throughout time and political theorists throughout time who have given a sort of image or ideal of what the utopian society would look like? And that's largely what I would say. I don't think Hegel is responsible for any of this. And I really do. It's something I'm perpetually skeptical of on the podcast whenever I'm asked about things like this, that it's very difficult for me to conceive that somebody could sit down and read Hegel who would never have been an authoritarian otherwise and then become such an authoritarian because they read Hegel. As Nietzsche says, one gets no more out of books than they already know. There was something already in them with which those ideas resonated, right? And because there is a tendency to conceive of what would the perfect state look like, Hegel just gives a voice to it in another form. But that tendency, whatever that X factor is, that desire to create the perfect political order, was there before Hegel, it'll be there after Hegel, and he's just one more expression of it, just like all those other authoritarian regimes are expressions of it. And, Hegel's no more responsible for it than Plato or Nietzsche or Marx, in my view. It's just that that's a perennial goal of mankind, and then people are always aimed at that goal, and then they find sources like Hegel and see, look, Hegel is a justification for this goal that I want to create. But, I really don't think Hegel is to blame. How do you define existentialism? Do you consider Nietzsche an existentialist? I mean, that question could be like a whole podcast episode in and of itself, defining existentialism. I mean, even scholars of existentialism have a hard time defining it. And I forget which episode I said it, but, I called it like a vague and cosmopolitan label. And what I mean by that is it sort of includes so many different projects and thinkers of such a variety of approaches that it's hard to say that there's anything coherent at all about the label of existentialism. I mean, I could just sort of reproduce the same old explanation of existence precedes essence and things of that nature. And that's also why it's very difficult to say, like, well, is Nietzsche an existentialist? I mean, sure. I think maybe if I was to try and get at it, what are people saying when they group thinkers together as within this existentialist category? A lot of what they're getting at is that sense of being adrift after the collapse of modernism, of the modern values being called into question from the world wars and the dropping of the atom bomb and the collapse of Christian values and the collapse of faith in liberal democracy. And in that sense, Nietzsche is sort of a proto-existentialist because that's the problem articulated in the madman's ravings in the God is dead aphorism. That, we're sort of clinging to the driftwood of Western society and saying, which way is up, which way is down, where will our new sun be? Where will we find a new star with which to guide ourselves and to sail by? And Nietzsche is one of the first to articulate the terror and the danger of that situation, and also to articulate the opportunities and the possibilities in that situation. And I think that's really the thread that unites all the existentialists, and in that understanding of it, it's really more of an emotional thing than a coherent set of ideas, right? It's an emotional a feeling of being set adrift and no longer being able to hold on to or believe any of the old values or presuppositions that we used to hold. And in that perception, realizing I have to find something new. And I think maybe one of the ways that the existentialists, another way that they're all united, is that they at least tend to say, only you can make the decision as to what that something new, quote unquote, will be, whether you must create it anew, or simply whether just the understanding that you are the final authority, and something I often say, you cannot abdicate your authority over what you believe. If you say, well, I just trust in the authority of the Bible, you're the one who decided the Bible was the authority. Nobody made you do that. So even when you say, well, no, there's some other authority in my thought, and that's what I trust in. Well, you're the one who decided that was the authority. So you can't get out of the situation of, realizing that you're the one who has the final authority to decide what star will guide you, so to speak. And perhaps existentialism is just the realization of that truth. So moving on, Jonathan asks, would you mind telling us about your interest/enthusiasm for chess? Sure. So maybe one way to explain it would be, no matter how much you learn about chess, there's always more to learn about it. I mean, you only have 64 squares on a board, and each player has 16 pieces. And yet, from those combinations, chess has never been solved. Like, tic-tac-toe has been solved, for example. If you know the solution to tic-tac-toe, there's no variation in the games. Every game will end in a draw. Every game is a tie. In chess, that's simply not the case. And even with these incredibly advanced machines that no human can beat, we cannot say definitively that, this is the exact way to play where you will win a game of chess every single time, because there are just too many variations. And as I've brought up before, there is Shannon's number, the number of chess games, potential chess games, which is larger than the number of atoms in the universe. Now, that's including chess games that no one would play, like games where, you have checkmate, but instead of checkmating the opponent, you make some random move, and then they make some random move, and then you make another random move, right? But even when you reduce the number to just games that would actually be played, or, the number of chess positions that there are to the ones that would actually make sense to appear in the game, it's still a massive number beyond all human comprehension. And so that to me is fascinating because, even at the level of grandmasters, you still see things. I mean, that's one of the aspects of chess that's maybe hard to explain if you don't have any experience with playing it. But once you play for a little bit, you'll see people make moves that the word that is often used is, wow, that's beautiful. And it's because I would compare it to when people say that's a beautiful or it's an elegant solution to a mathematical proof or a geometric proof. And this type of language people often use in chess as well, where they will speak of, when I make this move, I'm making the argument that even though I'm giving away this piece, it will give me faster development that will allow me to control the center of the board, right? They'll actually speak in that language. I'm making an argument when I use this piece. And people will also speak in the language. That line is refuted by this move. And so it's like you're both doing a geometrical proof, because chess is fundamentally just a game of geometry, and you'll make an argument and your opponent tries to refute your argument. And it's a war of like geometrical mathematical proofs, and people will then find elegant or beautiful solutions to a given problem with the argument they've made. In the same way that someone in making a philosophical argument or in a mathematical equation will find a beautiful or elegant solution to deal with some problem with the proof that they've laid out. And it's very hard to describe what this beauty, what the nature of it is, but you'll see it if you play the game. When, I remember I had a checkmate against somebody where I was able to, and this wasn't like planned, but I, lined up like three different kinds of pieces, all in the same diagonal, and each one of them came into play in response to one of the opponent's moves, and then it was just like this really nice, pretty geometrical shape at the end. Or, just some ending board positions where you find this move that nobody would have thought of playing, or like you just on first glance, it wouldn't make sense to make that move, but it's actually the perfect move. And when you play against a really strong computer, the computer will make moves like that make absolutely no sense, but it's because the computer can see that 7 or 8 moves down the line, it's going to allow it to do something that you didn't foresee. And so that's what I sort of like, is that it's like an infinite, with just this very small number of variables, seemingly. You have an almost infinite well of possibilities that you can delve into. And it's a game that people have played for hundreds of years. That's another thing that's very fascinating to me, is like chess history. You can read about the opera game where Paul Morphy, who's this American chess superstar in the 19th century, goes over to Europe and is just crushing everybody, all the best players in Europe. And then he goes to see an opera with the Duke of Brunswick and one of the Duke's friends, Valvenarge, actually. And then they all get bored with the opera and say, let's play chess. And then, it's a game in the sort of like romantic school of chess that's popular at the time. And so, we have these records of games that are preserved from hundreds of years, and all these different eras of the game, and all these different sort of interesting characters that played. And they're still oftentimes relevant to today. That, one thing I will say is the game that's often referred to as the, quote, immortal game, which is a game within the romantic school of chess, is one of the silliest games I've ever seen among the famous chess games, where even as I would consider myself a beginner at chess, because I'm rated like 1,000 on chess.com. I've been playing for about a year. I've played my whole life. Like I played when I was a kid even, but playing seriously for about a year, we'll say. And even as a beginner myself, going and studying the immortal game, I was like, these are very dubious. That's another line people will use talking about chess positions, is that's dubious, right? Doubtful. It's, again, that language of argumentation is very interesting. That it's a game that's seemingly simple, but it has this endless depth to it, and the history is also very fascinating to me. And it boggles my mind that, as good as I have gotten at the game, being like 1,000 rated or something, a little bit over that, there are people out there who are twice as good as I am, who would beat me like 99 times out of 100. And then there are players who would beat them 99 times out of 100. That the skill level scales in this massive way. Whereas meanwhile, somebody who would barely played the game or had a cursory knowledge of the game, I'd probably beat them 99 times out of 100. It's endless, the ladder that you can climb. And so that is fascinating to me. It's this game that's been played for hundreds of years, and it still has all this mystery to it. Okay, My Piano asks, what are Nietzsche's thoughts on the infinite? Okay. I don't know exactly what you mean by the infinite. You just mean the concept of infinity? I mean, because my own thoughts would be, if we're going to stick with the phenomenal world, the world of experience, which is largely Nietzsche's project, at least that's the basis of it, we'll say the foundations, there is no infinite, right? When have you ever experienced infinity? Everything we experience is finite. And so the infinite kind of seems like another beyond thing. On the other hand, Nietzsche, in some of his more esoteric writings, or his more metaphysical writings, especially when he's sort of considering eternal recurrence, seems to treat infinity as a comprehensible and useful quantity. I've tended to see infinity as a direction, actually, is maybe one of the more useful ways to look at infinity, that it's not an actual quantity. It's a direction. Zero in one direction and infinity in the other. And, you can proceed in that direction for an infinite amount of time by definition. And Nietzsche, like many who are, Nietzsche is scientifically minded in many ways. And when he's attempting to prove his theories in a scientific sense, he's willing to use infinity in that way. You might look at the chapter in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, The Vision and the Riddle, where he talks about this moment, sort of like standing under a threshold called moment, and an infinite amount of time proceeds forward in time from the moment, and an infinite amount of time proceeds backwards into the past from the moment. So he uses the quantity or the concept of infinity in his writing, but I don't recall any specific Nietzschean meditation on the concept of infinity. So maybe that's a bit of a disappointing answer, but I'm just being honest. I don't really know if I have anything much elucidating to say about the infinite regarding Nietzsche's thoughts about it. So with that, I will move on. Gutso Pink. I see Nietzsche as predicting the decline of modern European man, but he also seems at times to affirm the fact that he himself is a representative modern European man. Do you think he affirmed the fact that his fate was tied to the fate of a declining European culture? To put it another way, do you think he saw it as his tragic destiny to go down with European man? Or do you think he is searching for ways to evade, transcend, metamorphosize away from the fate of European culture? Well, I mean, he says he has ascent and descent within his destiny in Ecce Homo. Within his, that inherited from his mother and from his father are both decline and sickness and health and vitality. And so I think he is, what does he say? He's a decadent who was aware of the fact that he was a decadent and fought against this decadence within himself. And I think that is maybe a genuine contradiction in his thought, that he seems at times to say we should take up the fight against decadence and decline, but at other times, which I think are his more sober moments, his more clear-headed moments, he understands, as with the critique he made of Socrates, that the fight against decadence only hastens decadence. And that decadence is good, actually. That is when you reap the harvest of your society, where all the greatest productions of art and culture come into being. That's when you have the greatest multitude of geniuses of culture produced, is during the decline and downfall of a society. And there's all sorts of numerous reasons for this that we've talked about in the podcast in the past, but I think Nietzsche understood himself to be, in many ways, the typical modern European. I mean, he's a scholar, he's an academic. kinds of people that he criticizes. He definitely holds to that ascetic ideal of the will to truth himself. I mean, that's much of the thrust of Beyond Good and Evil, is that these other philosophers have not actually followed the will to truth. They have simply been sophistically expressing their own perspective, their own involuntary and unconscious memoir. And we free spirits who have a hardness to actually take and endure and accept the truth are actually going to follow the will to truth, which is going to lead us to see the most terrible truth, that truth itself is not even an element of our thought. And that's why all of these philosophers are always simply expressing their own value, the moral or immoral ends, which served as the germ for the entire project. And so, if that's the case, that Nietzsche's saying, we're going to follow the will to truth harder than anyone ever followed it, then he is an archetypal modern European man, an archetypal scholar with this ascetic love for the truth. That's the preface to Beyond Good and Evil. If the truth is a woman, then all of these people have been clumsy at winning a woman's heart. I'm going to court the truth. I'm going to show you how to do it the right way. And so, if we compare that kind of description of what Nietzsche's project is to Socrates, and Socrates as the opposer of the noble Athenians who never knew the reasons for what they did or believed, then Nietzsche is definitely a typical modern European man who was not at all like those noble Athenians of the master morality. And in fact, we could even say his entire genealogical study of morality is only possible because this is, as Nietzsche puts it, the age of comparisons. It's a cosmopolitan age where we can compare and contrast these different perspectives. Even the ability to do that is to step outside of the particular morality that you've been inculcated with, to question that morality, to hold yourself apart from it and consider it critically. That's already to place yourself outside of it. And so that, again, is part of the modern condition of the European man. As far as whether he thinks it's his tragic destiny to, go down in flames with the rest of Europe, I would just think that we should always keep our focus on the fact that Nietzsche thinks the revaluation of values has happened in the past and it will happen again in the future, and that I don't think he has his eye to... I think we're thinking about this from the wrong perspective if we think of European culture as something that can live forever or could even endure forever. European culture is going to eventually decline and fall, and then something else, maybe it will also be a new form of European culture, just as Roman culture was a form of European culture before Christianity, and then, the Holy Roman Empire, and so on and so forth. Those are both quote-unquote European cultures, but, to somebody from ancient Rome, they would have said, if you showed them the Holy Roman Empire 1,000 years later, like, oh, these are Teutonic peoples that overthrew us and are practicing a totally different religion, speaking different languages. They're not sacrificing to the gods that we sacrifice to. No, our culture has fallen. It's gone. And that's the fate of all cultures and all civilizations. And I think Nietzsche understood that. And if you let go of this desire to hold on and make it permanent, to make your culture, your society, your set of values permanent, to achieve that Hegelian state at the end of history, if that's not your goal, I don't think Nietzsche would see it as sort of a binary choice between going down with the fate of European culture or somehow revivifying it. Because culture always gets revivified. It doesn't come back in the same form that it always was. It always dies and is reborn. Nietzsche, I think, is aiming for something which is timeless and outside of that. That's why he talks about his great politics rather than petty politics. People have debated what that means, and I think, well, Nietzsche's great politics is something that is above the politics of individual, temporary, transitory nations and cultures that are like so many different individual life forms, that they live and they die. he was trying to encapsulate some sort of truth about life that could be, again, a sort of new guiding star for people, potentially well after the Europe that Nietzsche knew was long dead and gone. And I think that's why he sees this sort of greatness to the philosopher as these self-legislators of values, because the philosophers are these characters like, we might look at somebody like Spinoza, the political reality that Spinoza lived in, the culture that Spinoza lived in. First of all, he comes from a family that left a very different Spain than the one that their ancestors grew up in. This sort of multicultural Spain of the Moorish peoples, where the Jewish people had far more rights and visibility within the society. And, you just had like a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. That all is destroyed and homogenized into Spain and Portugal, and everything is made Catholic, Spanish, European. So, and then he's in a new political situation in Amsterdam that's what Spinoza grows up in. And we could just as easily argue that the Christian society of Europe in the 1600s, dominated by these disputes between Catholics and Protestants and Calvinists and so on and so forth, is also a bygone age that doesn't really exist. That culture that he lived in is mostly gone as well. But Spinoza still exists. Like, Spinozism is still, people still read Spinoza's ethics. People still, regardless of what culture or century they're in, can pick up a copy of Spinoza's ethics and get something out of it that is timeless, that is beyond, none of us today in modern age have any concern with whether the Amsterdam of the 1600s ought to be preserved or not, because it's all academic at this point. That culture doesn't exist anymore. None of us have any connection to it. And so the beautiful thing about the philosopher and his ability to legislate values and to leave us with these world pictures in the form of concepts is that they transcend the cyclical sort of grinding on of the cycle of nations and empires. And I think Nietzsche wanted to place himself on that level. And does that mean he didn't care about European culture? No, I don't think it means that. I think that he wished that whatever new iteration of European culture emerges, that it could be stronger and more vital and more worldly. And that's his great politics, so to speak. But I also don't think he had any illusions of sort of establishing this as a new philosophical kingdom on earth, a new state at the end of history. And I think he saw decline as an inevitable thing. And because he feels both ascent and decline within himself, I think that's another way in which he can stand for both sides, so to speak. He can see the inevitability of it. He can accept it with that sort of trusting fatalism. He can also say, but nevertheless, let me stand up for these values, stand for these values as I see them, that might be salvaged or held on to, even after the shipwreck of European culture. I hope that made sense. That was a difficult question to answer, but I think Nietzsche is multifaceted on this question, and sometimes he contradicts himself. For my part anyway, I think he understood he was a representative of the modern European man, for sure, albeit one who was more self-aware and often fought against the decadence and the flaws inherent to that type of man, and wanted to present something that was beyond that could survive the endless turning wheel of, again, the rise and fall of empires and cultures. Okay, Marco Mendez asks, could you please talk about Aristotle's criticism of Heraclitus and the light of Nietzsche's thought? Perhaps it's purely speculative, but just as an exercise of thought, what would Nietzsche make of this? On one hand, it seems that Nietzsche and Heraclitus believed that there are some innate contradictions in our concepts and language. On the other hand, Aristotle's adoption of the principle of non-contradiction seems to me, from Nietzsche's perspective, as Aristotle imposing rules on language. Aristotle wants us to classify certain phrases as invalid, but the phrases from Heraclitus, that the river's permanence is at the same time impermanence, or that the concept of set is at the same time one and many, points toward the fact that this wouldn't make total sense. I have a really hard time positioning Nietzsche in the middle of all this, because I also think he believes in something like Heraclitus's logos, which is not changing, and he sees some of that logos in logic itself, with all the human and cultural perspectives as well. Thank you. Well, thank you, Marco. I think that... Okay, so Aristotle's criticism of Heraclitus, if I remember correctly, he says that the principle of non-contradiction is the most certain of all principles. And that's one of the famous lines from Aristotle's Metaphysics. But he goes on to say immediately after that, and yet there are some of these morons out there who deny it, like the sophists and the natural philosophers, and he brings up Heraclitus quite a bit. He doesn't call them morons, but he basically says, yet there are men who deny this. And Heraclitus is a sort of whipping boy that he brings up, I think, more than anyone else, as an example of someone who does not, who violates the law of non-contradiction. And what Aristotle says about this is, in the specifics, is actually rather interesting, that the mistake they're making is that they're relying, what the natural philosophers, mainly means the pre-Socratics, the mistake they're making is that they're relying on their sense impressions of the world. They're relying on the sense data that they see. And then what they see is that things change from one thing to another. Things change from one state to an opposite state. And this leads them to make the mistake that there is a rising and passing away, that things pass from being to non-being, and that therefore contradictory qualities, we might say, exist within the same object. That's, I think, how Aristotle would put it. That basically they're making the mistake of saying a thing is both itself and something opposite itself. But the reason why they make this mistake is because they see how, for example, the hot becomes cold, that which lives dies, and so on and so forth. So does that not mean that the living thing contains death within it? And Heraclitus has an aphorism, I think, to that effect. Let me see if I can find it, actually. Okay, so this is Heraclitus's fragment 88, quote, "The same within, living and dead, awake and sleeping, and young and old. For these, changing, are those, and those, changing in turn, are these." End quote. We also have 67, quote, "God, day, night, winter, summer, war, peace, satiety, hunger. He changes just as fire, when it is mixed together with incense, is named according to the scent of each one." End quote. And so we see this in Heraclitus's writing, that he sees the ways in which one thing becomes another thing, which is apparently opposite to it. Maybe the problem with Aristotle's interpretation is that, and scholars have noted this, Heraclitus doesn't ever use the term enantios, like opposites. Heraclitus doesn't actually say things become the opposite of what they are. He doesn't use the conception of opposition in describing the way in which these transformations occur. Aristotle uses opposition. He uses enantios, the idea of opposites, in order to explain this. And I think that's actually very important, because as you bring up the river example, what Heraclitus is saying there with you can't step into the same river twice, what Heraclitus is saying there about the river is that its identity is fluid, for lack of a better word. Literally, it's fluid. It's water, right? But that there is a fluidity to identity. There is a transitoriness to the substance of phenomena. They are not, what would we say, consistent in the substance that makes them up. Even in the sense of the river being a process or an event rather than a thing, that the literal water that makes it up is flowing, is changing from moment to moment. And so, and yet at the same time, this seems to be an affirmation of the river's identity as a process. And that's maybe what you point to with the logos. Change is the law, right? Transformation, becoming, is the law that governs things within this phenomenal world. It is on the basis of that change and transformation that the identity of things can be established. And when we look at Heraclitus talking about opposites, I mean, we might consider his aphorism that the way up and the way down are the same road. And what that literally means, the way I interpret it, and this is based on the way some scholars interpret it, if you're standing at the bottom of a road that goes up a hill, that's the way up. If you're standing on the top, then that's the way down. And that might be a mere truism, but it's saying, when you call that the way up, that's based on where you're standing. It's not based on something inherent to the path. And so is Heraclitus saying there that that path contains two opposite things, the way up and the way down? No, he's saying you are interpreting it in an opposite way according to where you are. We might also consider dogs bark at people they don't know, or the ass prefers straw to gold. Well, of course, the donkey prefers straw to gold because it can eat the straw and it doesn't know what gold is. I mean, it's not going to... Donkeys don't have an economy where they can trade gold for straw, but we prefer gold to straw because we've invested value into the gold. The value in gold or straw is based on what you are and what is valuable to you based on the circumstances you're in. You're imparting or imbuing that value on the thing. And so I think this is just my perspective. We can get into Nietzsche in a second. Aristotle's somewhat mistaken about what Heraclitus is even arguing. That while there were natural philosophers who did view things this way, that the opposite elements could be contained within the same phenomena. We might say Anaxagoras is somebody like that. Even that kind of raises problems because it's like, are fire and water quote unquote opposite elements, or are they just different phenomena? That's open to debate. And I think Aristotle might be imposing that whole thought model of opposition. We'll set all that aside. But I think he's incorrectly grouping Heraclitus with these other figures because that's not what Heraclitus is saying. He's saying you're creating those oppositions. You are calling those things opposites based on your perspective and based on who and what you are, but it's not inherent to the thing. You're imbuing the thing with that sense of opposition. That being said, there is sort of like a second order consideration that we can make in light of these Heraclitean arguments, that supposing that all of these descriptors that we place onto a given thing are, we might say, ersatz, they're added on by our perception of them and our perspective, then yeah, you could conclude, as you say in your question, I think quite aptly, that yes, these are innate contradictions, but they're contradictions in our concepts and our language. And I think you're also correct that, you say you have a hard time placing Nietzsche in the middle of this, but I think Nietzsche would be, I think you also accurately describe Nietzsche. That maybe the way I would phrase it is that he would see that Aristotle was taking these rules for coherent linguistic communication, in which we have to create these categories, these conceptual categories, in which there is not contradiction for the sake of just getting across information, and then attempting to apply that as a metaphysical principle on reality, whereas Heraclitus recognizes that application of the law of non-contradiction for exactly what it is, something imposed upon reality by human logic, human sentence construction and language, basically. And Nietzsche fully recognizes this, and this goes all the way back to his essay on Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense. Maybe the complication you raise is that Heraclitus's logos as something which is not changing. But again, it's rather easy for us to get out of that, right? Because we can just say the trouble with conveying that change is eternal, which is sort of what the logos stands for, is just another one of those problems of language, that we are violating a rule of language by apparently expressing such a contradictory principle as change is eternal. And yet the reality is that that's not a contradictory principle. It's just the fact that change is eternal. And because we've created these two oppositional categories, these two enantios of change and eternality, that it appears that way to us. But, it's just simply how do you want to regard the logos? Do you want to regard the logos as this as the principle of the individual instantiations of becoming, or do you want to regard it from on high as this eternal thing which apprehends over all of these individual instantiations? That the way up and the way down are the same, and that's maybe that'll be my Zen koan like answer to that concern. But again, I think I'm glad that you brought this up, because Aristotle's criticism of Heraclitus is actually something I think everyone should read if you've already gone and become interested in Heraclitus and read his fragments. Going and reading Aristotle's Metaphysics, especially after you've read a lot of the Pre-Socratics and Socrates and Plato, you see, for one, that Aristotle is, within Aristotle's work, is the birth of so many concepts that were carried through to Western philosophy. I mentioned Spinoza earlier. Could Spinoza's sort of language in his conceptual world exist without Aristotle's notions of substance and qualities? Probably not, right? Aristotle is so formative and influential on Western thought, but he tangles with a lot of these other figures. And once you become familiar with Greek philosophy broadly, Aristotle will probably be a much more enjoyable read for you. I haven't really gone into Aristotle as much in the podcast, but the main reason for that isn't because I have any antipathy toward Aristotle. I also don't really have much great love for Aristotle. It's mainly because Nietzsche doesn't talk about Aristotle that much. Aristotle is sort of it's almost remarkable how absent Aristotle is from Nietzsche's thought. And that in itself is another big question that is worth pondering, of why Nietzsche, a classical philologist who surely was very familiar with Aristotle's work, didn't really talk about him that much. And that leads me to think that Nietzsche didn't think Aristotle was terribly interesting. And, there may be some truth to that possibility, but I don't know. Maybe we'll do an episode on Aristotle in the future. Just, for my own edification, if nothing else. All right, this is our final question from Chris Hughes. Reading Nietzsche, it seems to me that he is calling us to move beyond our current political systems and forge a new way forward. Given that Nietzsche dislikes capitalism, communism, socialism, fascism, and even nationalism. As you've stated previously, he even realizes that we cannot go back to a form of radical aristocracy that he would prefer. Thoughts? Well, as far as specific thoughts, here's what I would say. I think for Nietzsche, what's fundamentally important to him is the question of values. He's trying to revivify the values that were beneath the radical aristocracies, which, it should be said, at the time when they were in vogue, they were not terribly radical. They were just sort of the norm. But we could say that Nietzsche saw the way in which these aristocracies of old were themselves a natural and vital outgrowth out of the state of nature, and that thereby there was something healthy in them. And this is often called the natural fallacy, but I think Nietzsche would on some level disagree that it's a fallacy. When we say, is it good just because it's natural? Well, that's sort of like a straw man framing of it, right? I think Nietzsche would say that trying to wage a war against nature is just completely ill-advised. That being said, he's also not saying, okay, well, this is natural, so it has to be the same for all time. Because again, the nature of the natural world is transformation and change. It's just that there is maybe perhaps a difference between what we might say the improvers of mankind attempt to do, which is to artificially engineer man to be something better according to principles which are anti-nature or anti-life. It's what Nietzsche calls morality as anti-nature. And the kinds of transformations or changes or progressions that will naturally happen, which will produce greater health. And that's really what's operative here in his thinking. Health versus sickness. And so to boil all of this down, there was something healthy, even though in those aristocratic systems, and there was something inherently sick in the political thinking, perhaps, that has evolved in the wake of Christianity and its otherworldliness and the ascetic ideal and all of these things that we've talked about throughout this Q&A. And so Nietzsche wants to salvage those healthy aspects, those healthy values. But I think it's a mistake to think, oh, well, what Nietzsche advocates is returning to a Greek-style aristocracy, because I think he was intelligent enough to realize that that's a pipe dream. That's never going to happen. And we simply do not go backwards. It's not, I mean, he writes a philosophy for the future. He writes for a man who has overcome all of the previous, what would you say, forms of valuing and forms of idealizing and idolizing that mankind has created, and onto something new. And this is why I'm maybe sort of dancing around your question, because, again, I've kind of touched on it before, all of these models, capitalism, communism, fascism, these are outdated thought models. They are obsolete. And we really need to get over them. And then people say, well, okay, what do you suggest? And it's like, I don't think anyone could have conceived of the notion of free market capitalism in the Adam Smithian sense, during the Bronze Age. Nobody could have conceived of that. Could anyone have conceived of, a communist dictatorship of the proletariat during the time of the Greek aristocracies? I think whatever it is that is coming next is will be something completely novel to us within our current models of thought. And I think we need to be open to thinking completely outside of the box. And it's just funny how oftentimes when people speak the way I'm speaking, they're really just talking about, like, let's imagine that capitalism, communism, and fascism and nationalism are all different sort of colors of paint. And they're arguing for, like, kind of dabbling your brush in all of them, right? And mixing and matching. I mean, maybe that might be involved, but that's not even really what I'm talking about, because that's still getting stuck within these old models. What I'm talking about is being open to the possibility that there could even be a political style of structure or a political order that we haven't even thought of yet. And that's often, people say, well, what is it? It's like, I don't know. It's something yet to come that we probably can't even conceive. There's probably new technologies that will completely reshape what the political order will be. And since we can't even conceive of those technologies yet, or we don't know what they are, then it's kind of hard to say what the future is going to hold. And I don't think in Nietzsche's view that it's terribly important that we come up with an ideal system, because the system is not what rules. It's always human beings. And so that's why Nietzsche's focus is on how do we create better human beings? And not better in the sense of artificially engineering some sort of unnatural new human being, but a supremely healthy human being, the healthiest human being we've ever, that has ever walked this earth. And, if the real question is who rules, then you want to create the best sort of, the best kind of mankind so that the ruler will be the best person possible. And if you buy into Robert Mickle's views, which personally I do, that in the iron law of oligarchy, many of these systems don't actually represent a different kind of distribution of power. They might represent a different mode or a different structure or way of carrying out or a different way of executing that power structure. I don't know exactly if I'm conveying this in a comprehensible way, but democracy doesn't actually result in the people holding power. It results in an obfuscation of power and a different means of the powerful maintaining their power, a different means of motivating the underclasses to uphold that power and work within that system of power. And that's what all of these different systems represent. Nevertheless, it's not as if you would have the exact same day-to-day experience under each of these power structures. I mean, you would obviously have a very different experience living in Stalinist Russia than we do today in America, right? There are different systems that produce different levels of abundance and happiness and health of the people. And it's like I said when I started out in the Nietzsche contra capitalism episode, at the beginning of that episode, that old rule of Cicero's, salus populi suprema lex esto. The health of the people should be the supreme law. That's really how you measure like the worth or the value of a given system. Does it produce the welfare, the good of the entire civilization? And you have to evaluate what that good is, what the health of the people is, in light of what your goal is, what your teleology is for that society. And so really, yet again, the question is one of values and what new teleologies, what new goals, what new conceptions will we have of what the health of the people constitutes in the future, and how are we going to go about obtaining that? I personally think within the next couple 100 years, the systems will be created that we have not even conceived of yet. And, maybe some philosophical ideas will be influential on which ones come to prominence or come to ascendance. But, if you think it's just going to be reiterations of the 20th century struggles over communism, capitalism, and fascism, that's as silly as thinking that the conflicts between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines is going to continue, beyond the time of the Holy Roman Empire. It's just, that's often the flaw in our thinking. It's the congenital defect of philosophers getting stuck in this in the paradigm or the framework that we're in now. And I think the great value of Nietzsche's political thought is that he doesn't think with any of those paradigms. And a great deal of my work has actually been targeting the people who want to conform Nietzsche to their paradigm, either to make Nietzsche a avatar of far left or far right politics, or a spokesman for Randian capitalist realism, or whatever it might be. And there's always this aim of getting you to conform. Like, if you're a true Nietzschean, then you have to be hard right. If you're a true Nietzschean, then you would realize that nationalism is just the herd. If you're a true Nietzschean, you would blah, 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 blah. None of that really interests me. And I think the great politics, those types of questions, the questions of value and what the teleology of the state is, those foundational questions. Who should rule, and how do we determine who rules? There's so much undiscovered country with those questions yet to be found. And I'm just not interested in conforming myself to any of these current political ideologies. And I think most of our petty political disputes of today will be looked back on as being exactly as irrelevant as those conflicts between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines or Ghibellines. I don't know how to pronounce these old words. Sorry. All right, everybody. I think that's all I have in me for this Q&A. I hope this was enjoyable. I hope I did at least a decent job at answering your questions, even though a lot of questions on sort of secondary literature or other figures outside of Nietzsche that I wish I were more familiar with, but it's given me some good, at least food for thought on who I could talk about or do a deep dive on in the future. Particularly, thanks Connor for the Byung-Chul Han for bringing him up, because I would like to look more into him. And all right, well, thank you very much, everybody. This has been Q&A number 9, and I look forward to doing number 10. And yeah, thank you to all the patrons. Thank you so much. You keep this show going. You give me the fire I need to push on, even when the stress and the many demands on my time and effort are pulling at me from all directions. It is the sense of obligation that I feel to you all for being, and the gratitude that I feel to you all for being such generous supporters of the show that keeps me doing this. So, thank you so much, and I guess that's it. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.